Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and welcome to another episode of The Critical Corner. Now, if you're new to my channel, you may be wondering what The Critical Corner is. First of all, if you are new, welcome. But secondly, The Critical Corner is a recurring series on my channel where I do reviews in shorter form of either all music or all movies. Today's episode is going to be focused entirely on movies, since the last episode was more focused on music. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our first film on the docket for today.
We bury it. Later on, we come back and collect.
Okay, so the first film we're going to be talking about today is the Netflix original The Five Bloods, which is the newest directorial feature from Spike Lee. Of course, Spike Lee is one of the most famous directors of our time. He's known for films such as Do the Right Thing and The Black Klansman. Spike Lee has a really unique voice and a really distinct style that I really like and respect, so I was very excited to see what he was going to be doing on this new Netflix original. Thankfully, for the most part, it did not disappoint. Now, this movie is about a group of Army veterans who go back to Vietnam in the future as elders, and they go back because they want to find this treasure that they left behind, and they also want to find the remains of their fifth comrade who was killed at Vietnam. So this movie is actually pretty solid overall. It does have its issues, it does have its problems, but I did overall really enjoy it. First of all, Delroy Lindo's performance really carries this movie more than anything else. He does a great job in this film, and I appreciate how complex Spike Lee treats his character, despite the fact that he clearly disagrees with this character's political affiliations and everything like that. This character is actually the most complex in the movie, and has the most things that he goes through. And the other performances in this film are great too. The person who plays Norm is pretty close to Delroy Lindo in terms of what he does, and I like how he provides a more balanced counterpart to Lindo's pretty off-the-hinges character. Now, as far as themes go, this movie is a little bit all over the place in terms of what it's trying to say, but I think ultimately, it's a big commentary on race and how people of color were treated during the Vietnam War and how it affected them years into the future, and it's more a commentary on race relations in America as a big picture whole. And I think that Spike Lee does a great job of commentating on that in this movie, although I don't think it's as powerfully done as it was in Do the Right Thing. Now, what is a little bit mixed about this movie is how it talks about the Vietnam War. It tries to do this thing where it intersperses real-life footage with the fictional footage that is done in the film, and sometimes this works, but other times it comes across as really confusing and disjointed. This aspect of the movie, them talking about historical figures and then showing actual pictures of the historical figures, can come across a little bit weird and a little bit choppy in some places because it happens very randomly. Like, you're in the movie, you're in the moment of the movie, and then suddenly they'll be talking about some historical figure and Spike Lee will do a quick cut to a picture of this historical figure, and I'm just not sure that it really works the way he intended it to. As far as other critiques go, I don't have a whole lot of them. I suppose that the beginning and the ending of this movie especially can be a little bit confusing. I think the ending almost tries to wrap everything up a little bit too conveniently in some ways, and then it ends off with this quote that I feel like doesn't really have much to do with the film as a whole, although I understand why Spike Lee included it. Still, The Five Bloods was a really solid film from Spike Lee. Maybe not one of his best, but it is one that I definitely recommend and that I think you'll enjoy. So, I'm going to give this a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars with a general recommendation.
I decided to stay here for a few days until we could find a place.
Shirley has these bouts.
She's gone sick in the head.
Next up on the list is definitely the weirdest movie I've talked about this year, and that is Shirley. This movie is about real-life author Shirley Jackson, who wrote the famous short story The Lottery. And this movie sort of chronicles her life, specifically during this one moment where this couple comes to stay with her and her husband, and eventually the woman of the couple, named Rose, enraptures Shirley, and Shirley sort of takes her as her protege and bases a story around her, and weird things start happening in the midst of this. Shirley seems to have some weird things happening in her mind and things like that, and so does Rose. A lot of psychological horror elements start to appear. This movie is really weird. I'll say that straight up. All the performances are great. Elizabeth Moss, of course, is great as usual in the titular role. I think she really sinks into this character, although maybe the author character that she plays, I don't really buy that Shirley Jackson was like this in real life. Maybe she was, but this seems like a typical type of author performance you'll see where she's just really bizarre and off her rocker and super sheltered and everything like that. But actually the best performance here is Odessa Young as Rose, the character who ends up being Shirley's sort of protege who she bases the character on. Rose's character is super interesting, going through all these different emotions about how she feels about Shirley and Shirley's husband, and we're never really sure where she stands. I like how the movie sort of unpredictably goes about the chemistry between Rose and Shirley. Sometimes it seems like these two characters are absolutely enraptured with each other, and then at other times it seems like they absolutely hate each other. Josephine Decker has a lot of confidence behind the screen in terms of directing this movie. I think she does a pretty good job at keeping this movie feeling somewhat plot-driven, even in the midst of all its weirdness. There's still a sense that there's a moving plot that keeps the movie grounded. But I do have to admit, the weirdness of this movie can be a little off-putting in some places. I almost think the ending is a little bit too weird. Also, this movie is not like your typical biographical film. It doesn't have your typical biographical textures to it or anything like that. It almost plays out like a Shirley Jackson novel more than it does a typical biopic would. Some of the choices this film makes in terms of how it presents its horror and in terms of how it sort of manipulates the viewer with visual tricks and things like that, it can sometimes come across a little bit confusing, and I could even see some people being really frustrated by it. Still, Shirley is a really solid film and one that I enjoyed, and one that definitely left me thinking. Although it's not really that accessible to everyone, I would still recommend it if you're a fan of horror movies, especially horror movies that are a little bit odd. I'm going to give this film a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars, although my recommendation is pretty limited because I don't see everyone enjoying this film, and I can understand why.
We can bring you on more regular. I hate to see you working so hard.
I'm doing the best I can. I don't have the rest of the money.
We don't do credit, we don't do layaway.
Alright, next up is Miss Juneteenth, which is about a woman named Turquoise who is a single mother to her daughter Kai, and Turquoise is a previous winner of this beauty pageant that her town has called Miss Juneteenth, and she was a winner of the beauty pageant, although unlike most of the other winners of Miss Juneteenth, it seemed like she didn't really get super successful or super wealthy, so she tries to instill the values of Miss Juneteenth in her daughter Kai, and wants her daughter to win so that she can have more opportunities than she did. And it ultimately creates this sort of rift between the mother and the daughter where they both have opposing viewpoints. Kai is much more enthusiastic about doing the dance team and doesn't really care about all the properness of Miss Juneteenth and all the richness that Miss Juneteenth embodies and everything like that. I think it does a really good job at drawing out this conflict between these two characters, and it makes you understand the conflict from both characters' points of views. You understand why Turquoise wants her daughter Kai to win the contest. She thinks that as a black woman, this will give Kai a lot more advantages in life if she gets this full ride to a scholarship, which she may not have the opportunity to do otherwise. I also really like how this film establishes its setting. I think this film has a real knack for creating the environment, the world. It feels so lived in and so real. It feels like a real life neighborhood. It feels like something you could walk onto and it would feel very lived in. Nothing about it feels artificial or anything like that, and I think that adds to the realism of the movie. Performances are great in this film as well. Pretty much every performance here hits, except for Turquoise's grandmother, who I do think is a little bit off, but she's not often in the film, so that's not a huge detractor, but the two lead performances are great. The woman who plays Turquoise, her name is Nicole Bahari, and the girl who plays Kai, her name is Alexis Chikaze? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, I apologize if I'm not, but those two are really great in this film, and I enjoyed their chemistry. They felt very believable as a mother-daughter pair. As far as critiques go in this movie, I don't have a whole lot of them. I think my biggest issue would be that the movie does move along a little slowly. The plot can feel very plodding, especially in the beginning half, and sometimes you're just wishing it would get to the point. Also, I suppose this movie can feel a little predictable in some places. I felt like I could predict almost every story beat. It is a typical story that is told, but I think what is key for this movie is that it's told from a completely different lens. And I think that lens makes this movie a lot more compelling and a lot more interesting to watch, despite the fact that the story can be a little predictable at some times. So for all those reasons, I'm going to give this movie a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. With a general recommendation, I think this movie is a good crowd pleaser and will be able to be enjoyed by almost anyone.
Mom, I know your daughter got smart and went to college and abandoned us, but I'm still here. I'm gonna be here forever.
Yeah.
Next up on my list is The King of Staten Island, the latest directorial feature from Judd Apatow, and it is loosely based off Pete Davidson's real life. In this movie, he plays Scott Carlson, a 24-year-old, basically man-child who lives with his mother, and he's basically just messed up, just doing all sorts of things that he shouldn't at his age. The main reason he's so downcast, and the main reason he doesn't seem to want to do anything and he's such a deadbeat, is that he lost his father at a young age, and this really affected him and his life and made him a very different person. However, when Scott meets Ray, played by Bill Burr, who is a fireman like his father was, he becomes affected by him, to say the least. This is really a coming-of-age film more than anything else, and I think that this film works really well in that aspect. Pete Davidson is great in the titular role. He is basically playing himself, or playing a version of himself, but I've always said that it's hard to play yourself more than it is to play anyone else. You've got to be really honest about who you are as a person, and you've got to be really honest about your flaws. And this movie, in part, was written by Pete Davidson, so this film does feel honest in that way. And I think this movie's discussions on mental health, how it portrays it, is actually really compassionate and really powerful, and makes this character a lot more sympathetic in ways, and I think this is an important representation on film for people with mental health disorders, that they can see someone who has mental health and who struggles with it eventually becoming successful and able to succeed and even go above and beyond expectations. All of the performances are really good in this film. I honestly don't think there's a weak link here. I've already talked about Pete Davidson, he's really strong, but I think Marissa Tomei is actually the highlight here as his mother. I think she really goes through the emotional gamut here. She really hits all these powerful emotional beats, and I really like how she played her character. I think she connected so well with Pete Davidson, and the chemistry between these two was simply off the charts in my opinion. And Bill Burr is awesome in this too as Ray. He is a fun character to watch, and he's really funny, just so natural. Of course, it's Bill Burr, so he's gonna be funny. But I like how Bill Burr anchors his funniness in a real emotional maturity that Pete Davidson's character needs. And I think, once again, he is able to have a great connection with Pete. Now, the issues I have with this film, once again, like with Miss Juneteenth, they're not that huge. I think probably the biggest issue is that Scott's character change happens almost too late into the film. I think the character change could have happened a little bit earlier in some ways, instead of in the last 30 minutes. I understand that this character had a lot of changes to do. I had a lot of growing up to do in the film, but the change almost happened a little too late, and because of that, it can be hard to sympathize with Scott in some parts of the movie. But still, The King of Staten Island is a really solid movie, and one that I immensely enjoyed watching. It's another that I consider a real crowd pleaser, and I think people will enjoy what Pete Davidson and Judd Apatow have to offer for this film. Strong 3.5 out of 5 stars for me.
Does this wall look right to you?
What are you doing?
26 feet. 21. This room.
This next movie you should have left. I don't have a whole lot to say about it. It's pretty underwhelming at its core. It's a horror film based off a book where this couple and their daughter move into a house in the middle of nowhere, and this house starts having weird things happen to it, and there's rooms in the house that just appear and disappear, and main character Theo, played by Kevin Bacon, discovers a journal where something is written there that wasn't written before, and he eventually tries to discover the mysteries of the house and tries to discover who's haunting it. So yeah, unfortunately this is a pretty typical haunted house thriller movie. There are some interesting things that this movie does, especially cinematography-wise. I think the house actually has a lot of cool potential for how it's filmed and stuff like that, and there are some pretty interesting shots in this film that I think make it have an interesting edge. But unfortunately, those interesting shots and those interesting moments are really few and far between, and instead, for the most part, this film is fairly predictable all across the board. The performances here are pretty underwhelming. I think Kevin Bacon is okay as Theo, but he ultimately doesn't contribute much to the film, and I think his good acting days are really behind him more than anything. Amanda Seyfried is good as ever, but I don't think she's in this film nearly enough to make it work. And ultimately, for as good as her performance is, her character is just not that interesting. The writers didn't give her much substantial to work with, in my opinion, and that really made her character suffer. Now, Avery Essex as the daughter Ella, I don't think this is the worst child performance I've seen by any means. In fact, she's really not that bad in most places. I think her and Kevin Bacon, even in some places, have a sort of sweet chemistry, and I think the father-daughter relationship is actually a pretty good component of this movie, although I wish they'd emphasized on it even more. Horror-wise, this movie isn't scary at all, in my opinion. That's what really brings this movie down. It has the most typical jump scares, and the villain in this movie is terrible. They have Kevin Bacon play the villain of the movie too, and his performance is so bad, it is crazy how over the top and ridiculous it is, and I just couldn't take it seriously at all. And ultimately, the scares in this movie are really what brought it down, because this movie isn't remotely scary, and it's more boring than anything else. Like 2 out of 5 stars for this film. No recommendation, really. This isn't a very interesting horror film at all. I am going to keep this last entry brief as well, as this isn't technically a movie, but I did want to talk about it because I do love theater. Of course, like most people, I wanted to see Hamilton live, but of course, the tickets are so incredibly expensive, so I was very happy to see that it was going to be released to Disney Plus in the midst of this quarantine time, and I really enjoyed it. I was a little worried going in that it wouldn't live up to the hype. Thankfully, it did live up to the hype. It was a really good musical. Now, I will acknowledge that this musical is not anywhere near historically accurate for the most part. There are some facts in here, some facts that obviously had research put into them, and some things that are obviously true, but you should definitely treat this as a historical fiction, especially in terms of how it talks about its founding fathers. I don't think the founding fathers are probably at all accurate to how they're portrayed here. I think they're probably really romanticized and everything like that. There are some vulnerabilities put in them and everything like that, but I don't think it's probably how they were in real life. In fact, I really doubt it. But now that I've made that disclaimer that this movie, this play, isn't entirely historically accurate, I'm just gonna still say I really enjoyed it. I think as a play, as a musical, this thing works really well. And I think the characters as they're written are really interesting to watch. Even if you do acknowledge that they're not historically accurate, they're still well-written characters. I think particularly George Washington is interesting to watch, and I think the performance is really great. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda is quite good as Hamilton, even though he may not even be the strongest performance in his own play that he wrote and composed. It's really interesting that this play decides to frame its entire story around Aaron Burr's perspective, from the perspective of someone we normally associate as a villain. And I think that makes this play work out in a really interesting way and makes Aaron Burr a far more sympathetic character than history has given him credit for. Pretty much every performance in this play is good. I don't think there's a single weak link. I think Jonathan Groff is a huge highlight as King George. He's only in the play for about 20 minutes, but his performance is so hilarious and so ridiculous that it is ultimately just a really fun time to watch, and it's definitely the most I was laughing in the film. I can definitely see why so many people loved his performance and talked about it in real life. Of course, the music in this show is good. I mean, you already knew that. My personal favorite is probably It's Quiet Uptown, which is a powerful emotional moment in the play, which shows Lin-Manuel Miranda's best performance, in my opinion. His singing here is so powerful, and he's really letting those acting chops show here. And there's other great songs here, like I'm Not Throwing Away My Shot, and Thomas Jefferson's song, What Did I Miss? Oh, and by the way, W. Diggs, also great in this film, also great in this play. So that's about all I have to say about Hamilton. It's really good, it's a great play, and I would even say it's excellent. It's one of the best plays I've seen, and I would definitely see it again. Very strong 4.5 out of 5 stars. I'm glad I finally got to see it. So yeah, that was the latest episode of the Critical Corner. What were your thoughts on any of the films I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. Once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please feel free to leave a like on this video, and to leave a comment letting me know what type of review you'd want me to do next. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.